And so he wants the Christian community to act in love and not argue about such disputable matters as food and drink. On the other hand, if people within the Christian community are insisting on certain celebrations, certain foods, as a necessary practice for authentic spirituality, if that's going on, then it's different. It's a whole different ballgame.
Welcome to The God-Centered Life with Josh Moody, continuing our look at the book of Colossians. The series is called Christ, Church, and Religion. Today's study, taken from chapter 2, verses 16 through 19, is called specifically, Don't Chase Shadows. Josh Moody is senior pastor of College Church in Wheaton, Illinois. I'm Tom Bastide. Thanks for joining us. Josh, you say early on in this session that Christ-centered Christianity has been vulnerable to disintegrating into religion. It sounds like in today's passage, Paul is setting up some guardrails around that.
Yeah, there's that. I think there's a constant tendency, isn't there, in Christian circles to begin to add in and add in and add in. You see it all the time, all these potentially good things, Lent or Advent or something, and that's fine. But when you make it, you didn't do something or other in Lent, therefore you start judging people for it, you start excluding people, you must follow this way of doing church. Well, that way of doing church is fine, but you make it a judgment, then you're slipping and you're chasing shadows.
Well, let's not do that. Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 through 19. Here's Josh.
Well, what I want you to see this evening is that these few verses teach us that Christianity is exactly the opposite of what most people think religion is all about. Religion, most people think, is about being more moral, probably more moral than other people. Religion, most people think, is about worship services. Religion is about special ceremonies and seasons of the year. Religion is about angels and ecstatic visions, really, if you want to get really funky. However, none of this is what Christianity is really about. Christianity is about Christ, my relationship with him, our relationship with him as a church, as he calls it to grow. So Christianity is an organic, personal connection to Jesus himself. I also want to suggest to you this evening that understanding this message of these few verses in this regard is simply the most important thing we need to do. Right since ancient times, and we see the evidence for it even here, right since ancient times, there's always been this temptation and a tendency for Christianity to sort of disintegrate into just another religion. It could be under the influence of specific false teaching, as it was in Colossae. It could be through the pressure of the surrounding society, which no doubt gave all the appeal to the false teachers here, who were encouraging the Christians to be more like the world and their approach to religion. And that's, the easier path, going with the flow, and that's what made it so appealing. But you see, if we're really going to find out what it means for Jesus to be the substance of all things, we need to get beyond this and preach the message of Christ and enjoy him personally as the source of our spiritual nourishment, as the head, as the substance. So let's try and do that. I've just got 2 points this evening. The first is this, that Paul says, don't let anyone judge you. That's verse 16. Do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. And then he gives a reason for why we are not allowed anyone to judge us. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. Most commentators seem to agree that despite the apparent kind of Jewish feel of some of these phrases, the Sabbath and all that kind of thing, the Colossian false teachers weren't exactly the same as what they were in Galatia, the Judaizers, who were clearly trying to imprint Judaism on top of Christianity. No, it seems like it was a little different here. At this point, there's things that just are a little bit beyond that. But however, at this point, he does seem to be referring to some particular Jewish religious elements. And so what we have here, it seems to have the feeling, this list of requirements, of a kind of sort of supercharged list of must-dos. You must do this, you must do that, whatever it is religiously, and must-nots. You must not do that, you must not that. Hence he says, do not let anyone judge you. And that's what it feels like, doesn't it? And it's sort of some of them drawn from the Old Testament tradition and kind of applied within a different context and without great regard for their original intention. So someone will be saying something like this: hey, you're not worshiping God on the Sabbath. Someone else will be saying, you haven't kept the Feast of Weeks. Someone else will be noticing that they were eating non-kosher meat, maybe. And the Colossians, the visitors to the Colossian church, were looking down their long noses, as it were, at the Colossian Christians. And the visitors were beginning to get a superiority complex because they thought these things were very important. And so, as it were, they were saying, call yourself spiritual. Look at your drinking habits. Look at what you eat. Look, you even break the Sabbath. And of course, once that's going on in a Christian community, well, in response to a superiority complex, what do you get? Well, the Colossian Christians began to develop an inferiority complex, right? Maybe they have a point. Maybe we're not very spiritual after all. Maybe we're not actually as good as we think. And our faith needs these sort of additional supercharged religious rituals and rules, these elements to be brought up to par, to standard. So what's Paul's response to that? Well, that's verse 17. That these things from the Old Testament, these religious rituals of one kind or another, he says, amazing, isn't it? They're simply the shadow. And of course, there's a picture there, isn't there? Many commentators seem to miss the obvious image that Paul is using. In other words, like a body with the light behind casts a shadow. So all these things that came before Jesus are merely shadows of what was to come, the body, which is Christ himself. He is the reality. He is the substance. Now, the Sabbath had its place, but even the Sabbath, was intended to point to the rest that we find through faith in Christ. And so he says, don't let anyone judge you about that or any other ceremony. You've got the body, the rest is the shadow. You've got the substance, they've just got the shadow. Now, there's a very important principle at work here that has great relevance to how we act together in the church. With regard to food and drink, Paul, frankly, is completely indifferent. He teaches on this in Romans 14. You can look at it afterwards. He does not think any food is unclean in itself. But if someone does think that, well, for them it is unclean, he says. Because anything that goes against faith is sin, he says. So if that's what they think, don't let them sin against their conscience. And so he wants the Christian community to act in love and not argue about such disputable matters as food and drink. On the other hand, as here in Colossians, if people within the Christian community are insisting on certain celebrations and certain foods as a necessary practice for authentic spirituality, if you like, well, if that's going on, then it's different. It's a whole different ballgame. They're not treating this stuff as a conscience matter anymore. It's a rule. It's something must be done or must not be done. A whole list of supercharged must-dos and must-not-dos. And then, well, Paul here in this context, well, then he says, well, we're not to allow that. We're not to allow anyone to judge us with regard to such shadows. Now, I say this is so important, and why, you may ask, is this so important? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, because there is this constant tendency for us to live, as it were, on the boundary of our thinking and our acting as Christians, but not at the core. We tend to make, don't we, secondary issues our defining factors because, well, they establish a niche for ourselves, they distinguish ourselves from other Christians, brothers and sisters, so this is what makes us different. And so, as I say, it's important because there's a need simply to see that we're not to be like that. Jesus is the substance, so that's what it's about. The other reason why this is so important is because I guess it isn't common for people these days to argue over new moon festivals anymore. You probably haven't had an argument over new moon festivals in your small group the last couple of months, I would guess, right? Well, that's of course the case. It is common for people to think that all religions are the same because they all have some sort of festival or special religious day or whatever it is. And so we who stick to Christ being what it's about, Oh, isn't this true? We're very liable in ourselves to begin to feel judged for holding on to the substance and rejecting the notion of the primacy of simply any kind of religious activity. They've got a festival, he's got a festival, she's got a festival. Hey, what's the difference? No, we say, don't judge me because I hold that Christ is what spirituality is about. Other things are simply echoes of Christ. They are shadows of which he is the body.
2 directives from Paul. The first, don't let others judge you. Josh will move into the second momentarily, but first, quick reminder that if you consume a lot of material via podcast, keep in mind that simply by searching for God-Centered Life on your favorite podcast app, we can show up there as well. If that's how you like consuming material, we're there and ready to go. GodCenteredLife.org on your favorite podcast app. Back into Colossians now. Here's Josh.
So we've had, do not let anyone judge you. And now we have, do not let anyone disqualify you. So verse 18 says this. Do not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you from the prize. Such a person, he writes, goes into great detail about what he has seen, and his unspiritual mind puffs him up with idle notions. Paul was always packed a punch, didn't he, Paul? Why? Because, verse 19, he has lost connection with the head. Again, is a sense that probably there was one false teacher with many sort of followers. He's talking about the main guy who's the false teacher there. He has lost connection with the head, from whom the whole body, supported and held together by its ligaments, grows as God causes it to grow. He's lost connection with the head. So, for you biblical scholars out there, you probably know that verse 18 is just one of the most contested passages in the whole of the New Testament, right? And so we're probably not going to solve it all this evening, but it's worth trying to figure out because there's some real good riches here. Seems to me that the right way to understand it is in relation to the mystery religions of the ancient world. So we have the kind of rules first, and now here comes the kind of mystical stuff. And these mystery religions, the way in which they are being sort of put forth and preached and sold to various people in a sort of Jewish Eastern cocktail, one kind or other, put together in some kind of syncretistic amalgamation. And they were sort of as necessary refinements to the pure gospel that the Colossian Christians to receive. You need this bit of mysticism, that bit of mysticism, if you're really going to be spiritual. And the reason why people think this is it seems here there are actually 3 phrases that Paul is kind of quoting, as it were, which seem to be, quotations of sort of catchwords of the false teachers that were the mystic devotee at the time, the guy who was into this mysticism, particular phrases they would use to sort of sell their wares. And those phrases were these. 1, delights in humility. There's a phrase they use, I'm delighting in humility. It's not wonderful, isn't it? Can you delight in humility? I'm so proud about being humble, but anyway. A sort of false humility, of course, as the NIV kind of puts it. And Christians, of course, know, and this has been what Paul's been saying throughout Colossians, know that God has given them all good things to enjoy, and that Christ, as the creator of all the physical as well as spiritual world, is surely Lord of the physical too. So Christians are never to be ascetics. They know that. They know that. God's given us all good things to enjoy. Delights in humility. One of the phrases. The other one is worship of angels. Now, again, it's difficult to work out exactly what the idea was there, but probably the idea here is the devotee, the mystic devotee, felt that they were able not to just have earthly worship, but somehow join in with the angels in their worship. Now, again, because of all Paul's been saying so far, that was an idea which the Christians could, if they thought about it, could confidently reject, and knowing that to worship God in spirit and in truth, as John's gospel puts it, means to worship him through faith in Christ. Well, Jesus is the one for whom you have access to God. You don't need to ascend to any other element or sphere or angel or anything like that. So there was that kind of mystic phrase that was out there that Paul was kind of referring to, somewhat cynically. Worship of angels. And the other one is what he has seen. It's a statement there that was discovered actually at the beginning of the 20th century to mean when someone has entered in and seen the secret, what he has seen, and then they take their stand upon it. And then they can boast of the secret sight that they have seen. Now again, if they've been paying attention so far, the Colossians, reading Paul's letter, that was a claim now that they could be equally as cynical as of Paul. They can reject that with confidence because they have access to the Holy of Holies through the atoning blood of Christ on the cross, who has been seen in his incarnation and death and resurrection. Don't need to see anything else, do you? Delights in humility, worship of angels. What he has seen. Mysticism. Well, Paul says, don't let them disqualify you. So how were the Colossian Christians going to protect themselves from getting disqualified from the prize? Well, Paul gives 3 reasons. Spiritual, they were saying, not just religious, mystical, not rational, many different paths up a mountain, that kind of thing. Paul gives 3 reasons. 1, the false teacher actually, he writes, had an unspiritual mind, or a fleshy mind. That is, their so-called humility that they were so proud of, I'm delighting in humility, probably emphasizing physical abasement, fasting, not eating certain things, ashes on the head, ripping your clothes or whatever it is, beating your back or something. All the external things that human religion invents to make you look humble. Actually, Paul says, that was doing nothing to stop their mind being as vain and puffed up as always. And of course, that was obvious to the Colossian Christians, because they were trying to be superior and trying to disqualify them. They weren't being humble at all, were they? There is a real Christian humility. Paul will talk about that in chapter 3. But that is of the heart, of the mind. And it's a work of the Spirit of God internally. And then 2, the false teachers, he says, had lost connection to the head. Now, why is that important? Well, these teachers were not out and out obvious deniers of Jesus. They weren't, the Colossian Christians never would have fallen for that, would they? Coming along, well, we don't believe in Jesus. I mean, no one who's ever been converted and just begun to get into some kind of discipleship course is ever going to fall for someone saying that kind of thing, are they? No, they kind of were into Jesus. They were people who say, yes, but you need more. You need a focus over here. You need this ceremony, this special secret initiation. Like people today who say, all roads lead to God. Because they were doing that, yes, but you need more thing, they had actually lost connection with Jesus, the head. One head, one body. Can't have multiple different heads. So Paul was drawing attention to how far removed the false teaching was from being really closely connected to Jesus. This is always the case of this kind of mysticism thing. Jesus just becomes less important now as well as then. Perhaps you read or heard that book called The Secret. It did very well on the New York Times sort of best-selling list or whatever. The Secret. Why did it do so well? Us authors ask, who haven't sold 10 million copies. It sold because it told people what they want to hear. I mean, just think about it. As if people in Africa are starving because they don't have a positive outlook on life. I mean, it's actually offensive, isn't it, really? Once you think about it. But these kind of spiritualities are easily swallowed because they do tell you what you like to hear. I mean, it's sort of attractive, isn't it, the secret sort of thing? Good thoughts will attract good things to you. I mean, And the Colossian kind of false teaching was more subtle too. It was all very religious, very super spiritual, very impressive worship, the worship of angels. This sphere up here, not sort of earthly worship, they were saying. Lots of special visions. But Paul says, where's Jesus? It's a sure sign of any false teaching, however impressive it may otherwise appear, if Jesus himself is being sidelined, for then we're losing connection with the head. Well, 3, the last reason he gives to empower them, as it were, to resist this kind of approach from the false teachers and show the invalid nature of the false teaching itself. The last reason here, 3, is that the body is growing as God causes it to grow. They're referring to the body of the church, of course. Now, it is true that church growth is not a sure sign of health. You can have big, bad churches. You can have big, good churches too, but it's not a sure sign of church health. We need other doctrinal and moral considerations as well. And it is true that being more holy, growth in that sense, can be faked, and it's that kind of deep growth that Paul probably has in mind here rather than simply numbers, given the context of spirituality and holiness that he seems to be talking about. Nonetheless, it's not by accident that the true gospel leads to holy churches and healthy, growing people. It's not an accident, you know. The seed needs water and it needs good soil. But if it's not a seed, it's not going to grow either. And so Paul points that out. And we should do too. What kind of churches are producing growth? What kind of gospel is changing lives? Where does that come from? It comes from the Jesus of the Bible. Not these mystical psychobabble things, right? And so then, friends, because of these ultimate realities, all find in Christ the substance, the body of which everything else is just a shadow, Paul is telling us not to allow ourselves to be judged or disqualified by those who claim that they have something better and that we need that religious mystery or those religious rules. We need to realize then that these apparently superior ways of religion are actually only shadows. And we also need then to watch unless we are tempted to go back to the shadows. That was the temptation facing the Colossian Christians, and I would guess, seems to me, it's a temptation that many Christians, not only in church history, but also today, face. You take the religious ideas of the world around them, and we live in a much more religious age than we did even 20, 30 years ago. A bit of mystery religion, a bit of Judaizing religion over here on the one hand, on the other, and you kind of add it to your own personal cocktail. And you add them to the Christian heritage, the Jesus of the Bible. Not just traditionalism, but Jesus of the Bible. Or as Paul calls it, shadows. Don't chase shadows, friends.
That's Josh Moody, and this is The God-Centered Life. Josh, what would some danger signs be that we're chasing shadows?
Yeah, I suppose it might be that impetus for chasing, that zeal, that passion, that central motivating energy around something or someone other than Jesus. And when that happens, you start pushing people aside and judging them if they don't fit into your little tribe or your little group. On the reverse side of that, of course, we could be experiencing that. We could be experiencing someone saying, you're not one of us because you don't follow this particular rule about this particular religious practice, which isn't central to the Bible. Well, don't let anyone judge you. Don't be put off from your faith in Christ. Get into a church that teaches the Bible rather than teaches religion.
You mentioned zeal, and my first thought is, well, what's wrong with zeal? But then you kind of remember Paul prior to Damascus Road. That was a lot of zeal there.
There was a lot of zeal there.
But it was without knowledge.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Josh. We'll continue with that study when we get together next time. In the meantime, I want to let you know the beginning of the study is available at GodCenteredLife.org. Other books that we've studied here at The God-Centered Life with Josh Moody available there. Resources as well. Your opportunity to help us spread this ministry. If you're able to share a gift with us of any amount, we'd love to send you Josh's book called Everyday Holiness. Simply go to our website, GodCenteredLife.org. A gift of any amount, we'll gladly send it to you. Next time we get together, politeness past.
In days gone by, in another kind of context, we felt we had to be very polite to each other. That may be a good thing, you know. But today, not so much politeness, is it? It's political correctness. You try saying that there's no name under heaven given by which men may be saved.
Our study in the book of Colossians continues. GodCenteredLife.org, resources for you. And this is your very warm invitation to join us for the next edition of The God-Centered Life with Josh Moody.